Hello, everyone. My name's Noah. I'm from California in the US, and I am right now in Osh City, where I am now broadcasting to you from. So today I have a presentation about the government of the US, how our government is structured. So let's begin. And if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat and I will answer. And even after the video, this will be put on Facebook. So if you have questions later, you can ask. So this is just a basic, simple overview of what is the government of the US like. So the most important thing you should know before we even begin talking about the structure of the US government is the political parties. So the US has many political parties, but only two important ones. They're the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. The Democrats are now headed by President Joe Biden, and the Republican Party, the last president from this party was President Trump. The donkey is the mascot of the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party's mascot is the elephant. Why, I do not know. So another important concept to understand is federalism. Federalism is a system of government in which the same territory is controlled by two levels of government. So in the US, we have the national government, the state governments, and we also have local governments, but it's important to understand that the national government and the state government both are in control of a territory. For example, in California, where I'm from, you have to follow the laws of the California government. You also have to follow the laws of the national government. Other countries have similar systems, but the US is one of the only systems in the world where the balance of power between the federal government and the state's governments is very close. In fact, most of the time, if you're breaking a law in the US, you're breaking a state law, not a national law. Federal government, which means the national government, has its own responsibilities and duties, and the state governments have their own, and then there's some that they have in common. So you can see here the federal government is in charge of the military, war, the postal system, which means the mail, printing money, having relationships with foreign countries, import and export, adding new states, copyright, and national elections. So California cannot decide to start a war with another country, right? And individual states cannot print their own money. States can't get into relationships with foreign countries. They can't make treaties with foreign countries and like this. So state governments are in control of local governments, schools, and universities. So every school in the US every public school anyway, is controlled by a state or a local government. They're not controlled by the federal government. Licenses in the US, when you get a driver's license to drive a car, it doesn't say United States of America on it. It says what your state is. So I have a California driver's license. Permits, certificates are issued by states. When you get married, your marriage license comes from a state. And then there's some things which the state and the federal government have in common. Taxing, so you have to pay taxes both to your state and to the federal government. Both can borrow money, both make laws, both enforce laws, both have courts. There's a court system for the federal and state governments. There are roads, which are federal roads, which are paid for by federal taxes. Then there are state roads. Both can regulate banks, both can maintain social programs. Okay. So now let's look at the federal government. There are three branches of the federal government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The three branches' powers come from the Constitution. This is very complicated, but basically the Constitution is divided into sections, which gives powers to each of these branches. Some of the powers are very explicitly explained. Some of them are a little bit unclear and are implied. Right. Okay. Legislative branch. So the legislative branch in the U.S. has two what we call chambers or houses. One is the Senate, one is the House of Representatives. So what is the difference? The Senate has 100 members. The House of Representatives has 435 members. In the Senate, there are two from each state, but in the House, they are based on population. So a state like California has many, many representatives, while a smaller state has maybe only one. Senators serve for 6 years, representatives serve for 2. Senators must be 35 years old minimum, and representatives must be 25 years old minimum. So they have, each of these chambers has a leader. So right now, the Senate Majority Leader, who is the head of the Senate, is Chuck Schumer. He's of the Democratic Party. And the Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. She's also of the Democratic Party. Right now, the Democrats control both chambers of Congress, but sometimes one can be controlled by one party, one can be controlled by another party. Okay, what do these two branches or two chambers do? So they have a lot in common. They both write laws. The House of Representatives writes revenue laws, which means laws to do with taking in money. The votes in the House of Representatives require a simple majority, while that means 51%. But in the Senate, usually they require 60% for complicated reasons. The House of Representatives votes to impeach the president, while the Senate acts as the trial in impeachments. And the important thing that the Senate does is it approves federal appointments. So this means ministers, ambassadors, judges. These are recommended by the president, but then they need to be approved by the Senate before they become officials. Okay, let's look at the executive branch. So here you can see President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and then in the picture with many people, this is what's called the cabinet. The cabinet is each of the secretaries of departments. In other countries, they call them ministers, but in the US, we call them secretaries. So the president and the vice president, what do they do? The president is the head of state, the head of government, and the head of the military. In some countries, the head of state and the head of government are different. And usually in most countries, the head of the military is also the head of government, but not always. The executive branch is responsible for the execution and enforcement of the laws. They don't make laws. Laws are made by the legislative branch. But the president has the power to do executive orders, which are complicated. It's like the president, he needs to do something using his power, do something quickly. He can do it himself or herself without going through the Congress, but this is controversial because executive orders aren't outlined in the Constitution. The vice president acts as the president of the Senate, which doesn't really do that much, but they act as a tiebreaker in 50-50 Senate votes. And now the Senate right now is split 50-50, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. So recently, Kamala Harris has had to break some votes, break some ties. If the president dies or is incapacitated by illness or something, then the vice president takes over for the president, becomes the president. There's also circumstances where the vice president will temporarily take the place of the president if they need to undergo medical treatment or they're ill. Okay, these are the cabinet departments. So these are departments, what are called ministries in other countries. These are called departments in the US. The State Department is the foreign ministry, right? And then we have all these ministries here on the left. And then on the right, some other people are also in the cabinet, but they are not, they're not cabinet secretaries. They're like other members of the cabinet, heads of certain agencies, such as the ambassador to the United Nations. So on the left, the order that this is in, how can I say? So in the US, when the president, if the president dies, the vice president takes over. And then after, if both of them die, then there's this complicated order of succession. And the order of succession eventually makes its way into the cabinet. And so this is the order in which they would take over as the presidents were, that there was some disaster happened and that a lot of the people in the government died. It's also the order that these cabinet departments were established. So like the most recent department is Homeland Security. So that's why it's at the bottom. All right. Judicial branch. So the judicial branch is the federal court system. So remember, we have a court system in the US that is federal and also one that is by the states. The federal judiciary is divided into geographical districts, as you can see here in the map. So what does the judicial branch do? The judicial branch interprets the law. So like laws are written, but you know, just because something is on paper, it can mean different things to different people. So that's why the judges are interpreting it. They're saying, no, this is what it means. This is what it is meant to say. And then sometimes they will decide that laws are unconstitutional, which means that the laws contradict the Constitution, right? And laws can supersede other laws. Like you can have one law and then get rid of it and put a new law, but you can't have a law that conflicts with the Constitution. The Constitution is like sort of the highest form of the law, right? And then they also decide cases. So the Supreme Court is the top of the federal court system. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Roberts. And actually, this picture is a little out of date because one of these judges has retired and we have a new judge which has joined recently. So they're at the top of this system, this judicial system for the federal government. And so cases will work their way through the system up to the Supreme Court. Okay. Federal courts decide cases of federal law. They decide conflicts between states, and they decide cases in which the U.S. government is a party. So like if somebody sues the U.S. federal government. But state courts do everything else, and most laws are state laws. In almost anything that you do, if you break the law, whether it's a traffic violation or petty crime, stealing, violent crime, it's going to be a state law that you're breaking most of the time, and so it will be decided in state court. Okay, so maybe you've heard of this idea of checks and balances. The idea is that we have three branches of the government in the U.S., and they all have some power that overlaps each other, right? So maybe the legislature, they mostly are handling laws, they make laws, but the executive branch can veto the laws, which means if the president doesn't like the law, he can like cancel it, and then they have to reach a higher threshold for it to pass. That's a simple way to put it. And then we also have in the judicial branch, this is the courts can declare a law unconstitutional. So right, this is like two ways that the other branches can have some power over the main function of the legislative branch. And there's examples of this for all of the branches. The courts can rule that something that the president did was inappropriate, or the legislative branch can pass laws over the veto, and they control the president's budget. So there's all ways that they overlap over each other. The negative part of this is that things in the U.S. government can sometimes run a little slowly because of all of this checking and balancing, so to speak. But the good thing about it is it is good for good governance, for transparency, I suppose you could say, for accountability. Okay, so let's talk briefly about state governments. Like the federal government, state governments in the U.S. have legislative, executive, and judicial branches. They're not exactly formulated the same way as the federal government. For example, some states have a bicameral legislature, like the U.S. government does, with a Senate and a House of Representatives. Others just have one house. There's differences in the offices between states, but basically each state, it's like a miniature version of the federal government. So like here, for example, California, where I'm from, you have the governor in the middle, Gavin Newsom, and then you also have the legislature and the Supreme Court, or judicial system with the Supreme Court. So the California state government, it's like a little mini version of the U.S. government, except that California is a massive, huge economy. If it was a country, it would be, I don't know, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. So even the California state government has an immense amount of power, a lot of power for being a local government. And then finally, in the U.S., we also have big cities. Small cities have mayors too, small cities have governments too, but they're not that important. But big city mayors and the local governments have a lot of power. Mayors in the U.S. are directly elected by residents of the city, which is not the case in some countries. And usually mayors in small cities aren't that powerful because they're controlled by other elements of the local government. But in America, the big city mayors tend to be very powerful. And so here's the mayor of Los Angeles, New York City, and Chicago, the 3 biggest cities in the U.S. And cities tend to be controlled by the Democratic Party. Of America's 50 largest cities, only 11 mayors are Republican. This is because the people who live in cities tend to be, how can I say, younger, more progressive, from more diverse backgrounds, and these kinds of people tend to vote Democrat at this point in time. That may not always be the case. Recently, cities are sort of bastions of the Democratic Party, while rural areas are where Republicans are successful electorally. So that is my presentation about the government of the United States. It's very basic, but it should give you a general understanding. And I can see that there aren't any questions now, but there probably will be some later. So that is all for my presentation. And if you have any questions later, please post them and I'll try to answer them. Thank you.